Disc jockey, drop the bass. Now the heads.
What ho chaps, it appears we're having a bally election, so it falls to me to explain the intricacies of the British parliamentary system and the whole current fuss to you. Do pay attention there at the back. Our elections are run under a system called, colloquially, first past the post. What this means is that our country is divided up into small parcels of land or population, or a bit of both. And each of those sections of land, a seat, is represented by a member of parliament in parliament. So our elections are carried out on a local basis, and the complete result of the local basis elections, the number of MPs, determines which party then rules in government. This is a terrible system for a lot of reasons. The main reason it's so terrible is that it is drastically unrepresentative. It is an extremely rare occurrence that the majority of the population backs whichever party is in government. So at any given point, whatever government it is that happens to be in charge of the UK is generally not popular with the majority of the people in the country and is ruling without their consent. This is because when you make it only so that the party with the most votes in each local seat wins, they can win with a minority of the local votes because the rest is split amongst the other parties. And then this can be repeated over seat after seat after seat after seat, with relatively unpopular candidates winning those seats and then going on to form the government, which compounds the problem. So you can end up with a government that just really has no real meaningful consent of the governed. It has no mandate really to rule, and this happens surprisingly often. And this whole winner-takes-all scenario that this creates discourages coalitions and makes them necessary far less often, which isn't necessarily a good thing. There's good things about that, there's bad things about that, but the lack of ability, the lack of reason to compromise, to find ways in which different sides can agree, overall I consider that to be a bad thing. Your mileage may vary. It also greatly discourages smaller parties. They can get reasonable percentages of the vote, but still have almost no representation in Parliament. The Green Party in particular has suffered from this. The Liberal Democrats have suffered from this. They've been far more popular in the past than the number of seats would give them credit for. And the first past the post system also distorts people's voting. They're not voting necessarily for the party that they want. More often you'll find people tactically voting against the party that they really don't want. So it just doesn't represent people's views. This can be hard to understand with me just describing it, so I've thrown together some diagrams and a kind of worst case mock scenario similar to ones I've done before to try and show you visually exactly how bad this is. So let's imagine for a moment that there is a tiny little island nation called Mingland. Mingland runs a first-past-the-post parliamentary democracy system, but it only has 3 seats. The seats are Arbitraryton, Bonar Bridge and Cockington. And they hold their elections. In Arbitraryton, the Snowflake Party wins 49 votes out of 100, while the Fascist Party wins 51 votes out of 100. This is repeated exactly at Bonar Bridge, but in Cockington, the Fascist Party only gets 1 vote, whereas the Snowflake Party gets 99 votes. So 2 seats return candidates for the Fascist Party, and 1 seat returns a candidate for the Snowflake Party. This means, obviously, that the Fascist Party then forms the government as they have the most seats. But wait, that doesn't seem fair, does it? The Fascist Party is ruling and in government, they have 2/3 of the seats, but they only got about 1/3 of the votes. Now this is obviously a joke and an exaggeration, but this is pretty much how it works out in UK politics. We usually end up with a party with only 1/3 of the vote, ruling over 2/3 of people that never wanted them around in the first place. Now, there's several possible remedies for this, from single transferable vote, where if your candidate doesn't get in, your vote transfers to your second favourite candidate, and so on down the line, or proportional representation, where you vote for whoever you want, and the seats are divvied up according to that. Yeah, and there's various things that are supposed to work well in our current system that don't, like MPs are supposed to help represent their local area. The real problem that we have is that political parties distort the whole process. And so that local link is just gone. People vote in a tribalistic fashion, not in a manner that's best for their local constituency. And MPs aren't really free to act in the interests of their local constituency anyway, because they have to go along with the party if they want the support and the funding and everything else. So there's a whole host of issues. Anyway, that's all airy-fairy. There was a referendum, people rejected electoral reform, we're unlikely to get it. It tends to favour the party in power, it tends to disfavour the small parties, but yeah, there's no real incentive for a party that's in power to change the system that gives them that much power. Implications of this? Well, it means that these elections are likely to be concentrated very much in a few key seats rather than to the country as a whole. It distorts everything, and whichever party wins is unlikely to represent the majority of people in any meaningful way whatsoever. But, this is the system we're working under. So, what's at stake? So what's going on? What's at stake? Where should your vote go? In my humble opinion, what's going on? Well, there's a whole bunch of things to consider, but calling this election is itself probably the most shameless vote grab move since the Falklands War, and Brexit is probably at least as damaging financially and so on as the Falklands War was. We were in no condition to fight that war, and it was only by the purest of luck that we won. And we were in no condition to leave the EU, and it'll only be by the purest of luck that we managed to negotiate our way out of that and retain any tatters of our dignity or finances. It's already a disaster, and it hasn't even happened yet. This is how bad things are. So it's being called the Brexit election. This isn't entirely true, but it's impossible to escape the shadow of Brexit. So we've got three main parties: the Tories, the Conservative Party, Labour, and the Liberal Democrats, who you could say fall somewhere in the middle. They're not really libertarians; they're more classical liberal, I suppose. But it's really hard to differentiate them in any meaningful way in a short video like this. Let's just say that they're softer than the Conservatives on social issues, but don't see necessarily the solutions as being the same kind of more authoritarian, centralised government-led way that Labour is. It's the kind of Labour light with a more liberal interpretation of things. In some areas they're more radical, in some areas they're not. That's as good as an explanation as I can give you. So anyway, this has been called the Brexit election, and the Tories are very much for a hard, most damaging, most terrible, most horrible Brexit. This is because they've been pushed to the right by the UK Independence Party and so on over the years, and they seem to have found that they can tap into this groundswell of dissatisfaction and blaming that goes on. I'm not going to make the mistake of calling it xenophobia, that there are xenophobes involved. There are legitimate concerns that lead people to this, and personally I blame the left for completely abdicating the conversation and leaving it entirely to the right to present their concept of the problems and their concept of the solutions without any opposition. That has been a huge tactical mistake by the left over the last, decade or so, and not just in Britain, worldwide. It's just been completely unwilling to have the argument, so that the right and the far right have been free to whisper poison into people's ears. That's where I lay the blame. That's where I think the problem lies. The right's gonna right, the left has just got it badly wrong. But the Conservatives are massively pro-Brexit. They want the hardest, nastiest, most damaging, most horrible one. Now, ironically, Theresa May was anti-Brexit during the election, whether through the referendum, whether through party loyalty or whatever else. But now she's adopted this incredibly hardline position. But if we look back into her past, we can perhaps see why that might be. As Home Secretary, she often came up against the EU on things like human rights and workers' rights. She wants to dismantle workers' rights and human rights, and once we're out of the EU, even though all that law is being signed over, you can expect that to get modified without the EU getting in the way. So that seems to be one of the chief reasons that they're adopting this kind of stance. It also, the desperate circumstances that Brexit will create will allow the Tories to prosecute their agendas further, things like selling off the NHS, pushing austerity even more, cutting back the welfare state to the bone, and all the rest of it. So Brexit relates to all that, but it's still not the whole of the election. For Labour's part, one of Corbyn's massive tactical mistakes was being so lukewarm on the Brexit issue. He should have come out much more strongly for Remain. His lukewarm stance, his kind of vaguely pro-Brexit stance that he's taken up now is kind of reluctant. Well, we'll do it, but we'll try to negotiate in a more softer fashion, I suppose. It's really half-hearted, and it's completely out of step with their core support, which is majority pro-Remain. If they adopted a stance of a much softer Brexit, of retaining many of the rights and privileges and so on, I think they could probably retain some of their base, maybe get some people from the other places who were for exit but wanted to keep some of these rights and so on as well, weren't for this massively destructive hardline version. The Liberal Democrats, on the other hand, are absolutely dead set against Brexit. They've got no chance of stopping it or anything at all, but in by-elections and in council elections, they have been doing very well on the basis of their Remain stance. And this is probably for a few reasons. Their base tended to be very pro-Remain anyway. There are a lot of very motivated and angry Remainers who will look anywhere for any kind of possibility of doing anything to blunt it at all, which they're picking up on. And also, the Brexiteers tended to come from demographics that don't normally vote. So when it comes to by-elections, council elections, and maybe this election, they won't be as motivated to go out and vote. So parties that take a softer stance on Brexit or anti-Brexit stand to pick up a great deal on that basis and to do well on that basis. So it'll be interesting to see how that affects the election and whether the Brexiteers will be able to motivate their voter base in the same way that they did for the referendum, given that, you know, they think they've won, they think it's irreversible or whatever, or can't be softened, and so maybe less motivated to go out and vote. So it'll be interesting to see how that happens. But in effect, this is in many ways a second referendum. Now, all that being said, this cannot be limited to the Brexit election. There is simply too much in the way of other things at stake in this election. If the Tories get a large enough majority, you may see a slight softening on Brexit, as with a larger majority, she might be able to challenge the more Eurosceptic rebels in her party. So, ironically, a strong Conservative Party may mean a softer Brexit, but there are other issues at hand. With that majority, they will also continue very strongly to try and dismantle and sell off the NHS, to try and dismantle and sell off other public assets. And they will use the excuses of austerity and of problems faced by Brexit to do this. But that's their agenda anyway. So my question to you, pro-Brexit people, would be exactly what price are you willing to pay for this vague idea of sovereignty that you like to tout around? We're not seeing less corporatism, we're seeing more. We're seeing the government have to bribe companies or let them off taxes and so on to get them to stay in this country. So it's more corporatist, there's more globalist corruption, not less. We're in a much weaker position outside of the bloc to negotiate on these things. Are you willing to lose the NHS for the sake of this? Because it's definitely under threat. It's being deliberately starved of resources. In real terms, spending on the NHS has declined slightly, but costs have been going up as our population has aged and as technology has improved, as we can treat more illnesses and things. So there's got to be a breakpoint somewhere. Are we willing to pay more, and it wouldn't be that much more each, for a better service? Or are we willing to let it be sold off? Do we really want to end up in the situation that the Americans are in? You have an emergency, call an ambulance, you end up being charged thousands of dollars for it, going into personal bankruptcy and so on, all because you slipped on some ice and broke your leg, or paying thousands and thousands, to have a baby, for God's sake. Do we really want to be in that situation? She's offering up our health services to America in trade negotiations. Already you've got Virgin taking over various services and so on. So there's a problem already. Then we need to consider the welfare system. It's already been cut back. We've got record numbers of people hitting food banks and so on. You have people literally dying because they've been forced off benefits that they need, all through this pursuit culture of supposed scroungers. And the irony is, it costs more to pursue scroungers than is recovered by finding those scroungers. We'd be better off if we operated an honour system. Financially, certainly. It doesn't make any sense. So all of this is at stake here. The very warp and weft of British society, the things that really matter and are important to us, or have been for years, that we take care of our own, that we have an NHS that we're rightly and justly proud of, that we should try to maintain at a level that we can be rightly and justly proud of. It's amazing what doctors and nurses manage to do with so little, how willing they are to stretch themselves, but there's got to be a limit to that. All the pluck and gumption you care to conjure up can't make up for a lack of funding, a lack of care. See, these are the kind of things that are at stake. What kind of Britain are we going to live in going into the future? Do we want it to be this kind of corporatist dystopian nightmare that May is presenting to us as some kind of solution or some kind of responsibility or whatever, or not? Labour's got their failings. Corbyn is affable but not charismatic. Their voters slumped, but at the same time their grassroots support has swelled massively. The party's increased in numbers. It's hard to tell quite what's going on there exactly. I think they suffer from some of the same problems that the Democrats in the US did. I welcome Corbyn as a shift to the left, as a kind of Bernie Sanders-y type figure, but he just doesn't have the presence to pull it off, and there's too much dissent from the Blairite wing within his own party, and that kind of division is severely weakening them at the polls. And then you've got Liberal Democrats, I suppose. They're doing well off their anti-Brexit position, but in a typical way that the left, or the remotely left, always does. You've got people turning on each other. The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron, has some rather outdated religious views about homosexuality, which have caused people to campaign against him, to set up parody accounts, to prop up a fish finger to stand against him in his seat during the election. It seems kind of pointless and it seems destructive. The real enemy of the Tories over there, his personal views, so long as they don't affect policy suggestions or whatever, and it's not like the Liberal Democrats are going to end up in power anyway. Why do that to yourselves? The enemy is over there in blue. It's not the yellow or red parties. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But this seems to be a problem all the way across. Labour are ruling out working with anyone else. The Liberal Democrats are ruling out working with anyone else. The Green Party's ruling out working with anyone else, I think. They may be the exception. So the chance of having some sort of broad left progressive coalition out the window, and that just hands things to the Tories, though they're doing their best to sabotage themselves as well with internal divisions and reversing policies and so on. So this election is just a huge fucking mess. I'm not stupid enough to make a call on this election, despite the polls. I mean, we've seen too many upsets for anyone to really feel secure in calling an election. I'm a pessimist, so I think the Tories will get in again, but I'm not willing to predict by how much or whatever. I mean, they've slashed their lead in half with their blundering recently, but they're up against such weak, fractious opposition that it's hard to see them losing, despite the horrors that they wish to inflict upon the country. I can't call it. I mean, the whole Brexit thing may cease to be anything of import depending on the result of the French election. If near-fascist Le Pen wins, she's going to get in on an anti-Europe ticket. So yeah, that would actually be the death knell of the EU, at least in its current form. If she won, that would be it. So that might make the whole Brexit factor redundant. That would probably favour the non-Tory parties, as it would then become entirely about domestic policies, the NHS and so on. But the opposition isn't pushing that at the moment. Maybe they're saving it, keeping their powder dry, conserving their ammunition for a final push towards the end of the election. But at the moment it just seems like a whole bunch of pointless shite coming from the opposition parties, to be honest. So I can't call it. I hope the Conservatives at least get weakened, not strengthened, and I hope against hope that they get booted out, but I don't see that as being likely. My appeal? Just don't vote Conservative. Whatever is going to beat Conservatives in your local constituency, vote that. Whatever your feelings on Brexit or whatever else, I don't think it's worth the cost of our NHS. I don't think it's worth the cost to our society as a whole to allow these people to run rampant, to tear away our workers' rights, to tear away our individual human rights in this way. Even if I was pro-Brexit, I could not bring myself to vote for this Tory government. So Brexit's going to happen in one form or another anyway at this point. So just don't vote Tory. That would be my appeal to you. Please. Do you want to live in a humane, decent society, and are you willing to pay a little bit more to maintain that humane, decent society or not? That's the real question of this election. If you do want that kind of society and you are willing or able to pay a little bit more, don't vote Conservative. If you're a selfish cunt, vote Conservative. Zang.